Good evening. This is the 9th in a series of 12 lectures on the Kabbalah. And as a result, a lot of material that I would like to make known to you about the Sephiroth has already been spoken of in earlier lectures, especially the lectures on astrology and the origins of Kabbalah. Those have been recorded, so at the risk of sounding like I'm beating my own drum, I direct those of you who are interested in more detailed information about those aspects of the Sephiroth to check into the earlier lectures. We're going to cover a different aspect of them today. We'll begin with a kind of brief summary of the way that they function, what they represent, how we are to understand them schematically. And then I'm going to do something a little bit unusual in Kabbalistic studies, and that is show how they have something to do with the Hindu chakra system and the idea of the Kundalini. And then we'll go on from there to whatever bounds my imagination finds most interesting at the time. This behind me is the Kabbalistic tree, very simply done. I have pointed out in earlier lectures that it can be recognized as the Egyptian Ankh if you draw circles around it, outlining it. And it has also been drawn as a lightning bolt. And there's also a kind of architectural drawing of it in which the different paths are made known. But in the actual tree of life, the most important elements are the Sephiroth. To understand them, you have to divide the tree into 3 parts. The center pillar, consisting of 4 Sephiroth, can be thought of as the spine. Going right into the Kundalini idea, this is the center of the Kundalini life force. If you think of the caduceus of Mercury, this is the center part of the caduceus. Then you have, just as in the caduceus and just as in the Kundalini, the left and right sides. Looking at the tree the way that I am and that you are, the left side of the tree is called the column of mercy, and the right side is called the column of severity. This has also been hotly disputed, however, by the Kabbalists that we know of. Some say that it should be reversed and this sort of thing. I don't think it matters all that much, to tell you the truth. The idea is that these are 2 emanations from that central point. This is the way that the cosmos is made. In Taoism, they talk about the greater yin, the unknowable no thing, from which emerge yin and yang, the positive and negative energies, active and passive. This is the same idea here. The idea is that these 2 other columns, severity and mercy, are extensions or polarities of each other, emanating from the center of balance. Now, having understood that, we then have to understand how the tree moves from top to bottom. As I pointed out last week, there are actually 4 trees stacked one on top of the other, representing the 4 realms of human and divine existence. The top of any one of these trees is called Kether, the crown. And the best way to describe that is this is the essential point of life, of consciousness, of being in anything. So I like to use the illustration. If you imagine that the reason you live is because somewhere in the center of your heart, God's fingertip touches you. That point where God's fingertip touches can be understood as Kether. That's the blurry line between the divine and the human. Then all the way down at the bottom is Malkuth, the kingdom. And this is the realm of the elements, the physical realm, in a sense the body of everything that comes above it. Let's move down then and then back up the tree, and I will illustrate what each of these represent. Excuse me for not watching you so I can see what direction I'm going. Beginning with Kether, we've got a kind of, picture this as a fountain, in fact. Let's do it that way. And imagine that what's flowing through is not water, but spiritual energy. That's a nice little hint, by the way, about the Bible. If you translate the waters that appear in it all the time as spiritual energy, you'll have some real fun. But imagine that there's spiritual energy coming down through these different cups, and the cups are the Sephiroth. It begins, the fountain head is Kether. That's where the water comes gushing out from a greater world of water that is unknown to us. And it immediately divides. There's a polarity. And this polarity is known in the Kabbalah as wisdom and understanding, But I would say that this is a problem of translation, in that if you try to differentiate between wisdom and understanding, you'll get yourself caught up in all kinds of linguistic confusions about, well, is one passive and the other active and this sort of thing, and it's not really in the Hebrew. The idea is instead what might be called female wisdom and what might be called male wisdom. And if you understand wisdom to be the ability to act without thought in a thoughtful manner, very Zen kind of concept, then you can see that the male energy is just pure active energy, which is always wise when seen from a divine perspective, and that the other side is pure female energy or receptive energy, which is also always wise when seen from the divine perspective. But so you have a primary differentiation in anything, whether this be a human being, a cosmos, a cup. First, the spiritual energy, the beingness that makes it exist. Then the polarity that makes a thing a combination of passivity and action. It has resistance in space, it exists, it pushes air away from it in a sense, and in another sense it accepts. There are things that are stronger than it, that can break it, that it can contain, that sort of thing. This division continues down another step into severity and mercy. Now this is a very interesting conception here, because it's in reverse to how you might think it would be. Most people think that the feminine side of the tree is called mercy. It is not. The feminine side is called severity. All kinds of ideas in that. Now, the first thing I want to state, because there are enough people here who have not been at earlier lectures that I've given on the Kabbalah, is that the Kabbalah as we have it in no way can be said to reflect the actual teachings of Kabbalah. Any book that you can buy on the Kabbalah that states it is the Kabbalah is written by an author who is lying to you. Because the Kabbalah is available only to Orthodox Jewish males above the age of 40, who are willing to spend years and years and years in studying arcane texts under rabbis who have the training. The Kabbalah that we have access to is a leakage. Things that got out through renegade rabbis, and also that got out through individuals who found Kabbalistic texts, had enough Hebrew to translate them, like MacGregor Mathers, and did their best through comparative religion and their own experience to guess at what was actually meant by these texts. On the whole, I would suggest that the texts are pretty accurate that we have outside of the actual Kabbalistic tradition. MacGregor Mathers did a pretty good job. There's a rather new author who's quite excellent by the name of Arya Kaplan, who is within the Kabbalistic tradition and is releasing as much as he can. And what you find when comparing his work to the work of those who are in the occult tradition and talk about the Kabbalah, even such giants as Eliphas Levi, is that it's a lot easier, a lot simpler stuff than it's made out to be by authors on the outside. Authors on the outside have come up with all kinds of crazy theories about what this thing means. It's actually a mystical system, the inside part of a religion, a kind of psychological discipline, just like any other, Zen, Sufism, whatever you like. It's the same kind of thing. It has a different sort of cast to it because all of them do according to the time and place in which they originated. So what I'm giving you here is an interpretation. I want to make that extremely clear and to point out that that's all you can get about it unless, again, you happen to be lucky enough to be the first non-Jewish woman to get into the Kabbalistic studies, and I don't think so, because they're still stoning people over there if they walk around, or drive rather, on Saturdays in the neighborhood where Kabbalah is taught in Jerusalem. But moving down from the passive and active wisdoms, another way to think of this active and passive wisdom is the animus mundi, the world soul. To us, the world seems unfair. We look around us, we see starving children, we see all sorts of things that just incense us, from very minor, comparatively, situations such as greediness causing destruction to things that we hold dear, all the way up to worldwide catastrophes like the proliferation of nuclear arms, this sort of thing. And we have a tendency to look around us and to say, boy, the world stinks. I mean, this is really a mess down here. And as a result, many philosophies that teach you exactly this point are very popular these days. People come to you and say, You're right, the world is terrible and it's a snare. And if you get caught up down here, you'll get crushed. That sort of thing. The Kabbalah, and myself I might add, are of a different school. And that is that no one is wise enough to judge whether the world is good or evil to begin with. You can have your predilections one way or the other. If you are religious, if you are even provisionally testing a spiritual path, then you must, to make any progress on that path, assume your own stupidity. That's the first step. You've got to say, I'm not all wise. Yes, it sure looks bad to me that Ethiopian children are starving and that we have nuclear proliferation, but I don't know. I'm not certain that it's bad. And if you have mystical experiences, you get to a point where you sometimes have what's called unitive consciousness, and you suddenly see that it isn't bad. You see things in a reversed way. This is a kind of adventure in Kabbalah in particular. They always talk about reversals, that things are the mirror image of what they actually are in this world. And so what you think of, for example, is that, yes, indeed, life here is beautiful, quite beautiful and exciting, but when you get out of the body, it's even more beautiful and exciting. And therefore, if you die young and tragically, what you're really saying is you've gotten out of here quickly and cleanly, and that's not bad, that's good. There's no bad either way you look at it. If you live to be a ripe old age, well, good for you. You're exploring more and more, getting all kinds of wisdom to use later on in your advancements. But on the other hand, if you go quickly, all the better. Got out quick. Got to find out what was on the other side. Don't have to guess about it anymore. So that's a very minor, rather weak example of the kind of reasoning that can be brought to bear. The Hindu conception of karma is another that can be used to understand evil. At any rate, there is a certain point at which a mystic looks around at the world and says, it is all good, it is all wise, it is all beautiful. And that point can be understood as the animus mundi in these top three Sephiroth. This is, of course, our Holy Trinity in Christianity and Hinduism and everything else. And that is just the pure beingness of the world, the wisdom of its passivity, and the wisdom of its activity. So it's a kind of an interesting thing here, because what the Kabbalists have been able to do is, in a single symbol, present to you two ideas. And the ideas are that, yes, everything in this world is active and passive. It works on polarities. And the other idea is it's all wise. And that's a challenge to you to find the wisdom in particular incidents that strike you as being foolish. Now, as you move down the next two Sephiroth, you get to severity and mercy, as we were just about to do. This is a kind of moral interpretation of passive and active wisdom. And the reason, I would suggest, that severity comes under the feminine heading is it tends to be true in human life that when we are passively dealing with things, that's when we have the attitude of, I'm too tired, I'm too beaten down, I just have to survive. So all I want to do is survive, which is what 90% of the human race thinks like. Then the world is severe. On the other hand, when you are a person who is full of action, this is the type of person who gets an idea to accomplish something, goes out to accomplish it, gets knocked down on his butt, gets up again, does it again, gets knocked down again, gets up again. Those kind of people find that the world is just full of mercy, because things always seem to wind up going their way. That's one little interpretation there of how that can be seen. But the point is, this is now the negative energy moving into the realm of emotion, where it's felt as either severity or mercy. It's no longer the abstract of positive and negative energy. It's now felt. And human beings like to look at something and say, well, this makes me think of the severity of God, and this makes me think of the mercy of God. Now, an important point here is that to the Hebrews, who were very different from ourselves, the severity was not negative. We think of severity. Yeah, I want that side of the tree. I like mercy. They're both good and bad. Severity can be great, if that's what you need. Mercy can be terrible if it's what you don't need. So if you get lost on either side of the tree, what happens to you is something like this. If you veer off the center and you wind up on the severe side, you turn into one of these bitter, upset people who feel that the world is just an awful place and everything's hard. Everything they do is hard. Every heartbeat is hard. And if you go the other way, though, on the side of mercy, you turn into, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but into one of the effervescent New Agers who are content to believe that at any instant the dawning of the New Age is going to hit, everybody's going to instantly change and be wonderful and Christian-like and all this sort of thing, and that nobody has to do anything to accomplish it, it's just going to happen, and that the world is just all peachy that way, and they do not feel the suffering of other people. Now, I want to take a little aside here and point out to you that although we can intellectually say, as I was mentioning earlier, as mystics, that the world is good and that another person's suffering has purpose and all that sort of thing, that doesn't mean that the mystic shouldn't feel the suffering. It's extremely important. You have to be able to, well, there's a rainstorm like there was yesterday, to look out over the city and say, it looks beautiful, it's refreshing, I love it. Smell the roses, and at the same time remember that there are homeless people who are being driven into very cold, very ugly situations by that rain. And one doesn't cancel out the other. The beauty doesn't make the suffering any better, and the suffering doesn't make the beauty any less intense. The mystic tries to keep awareness of both, and that's balancing severity and mercy. Then the waters reunite. We're back in the central part of the tree, and this is an area called Sephiroth, or beauty. This is a very beautiful conception, and I would appeal to Neoplatonism to explain it, and that is the Neoplatonists always used to say that the one, in other words, everything, and also the source of all things, the good, capital G, the true, the beautiful, all capitals, they are all one thing. So the idea in this center of Sephiroth, in a sense, is that the center of a being is beauty. And that center is self-expressive. It's like the sun. And anything that is purely self-expressive, that represents the balance of polarities, is beautiful. A beautiful work of art is a work of art that has balanced thoughtfulness and inspiration, planning and spontaneity. That's true of anything that a person does. Beauty comes from balancing the receptive and the active sides. So an illustration, we do not have many great artists these days. And I do not speak that from the perspective of a 19th century romantic who feels that everything written after Keats is bad. I say it from the perspective of a mystic and a Platonist. And what I mean by it is that we have two kinds of artists these days. We have artists of severity who know all the technique in the world, and that's it. They cannot release themselves to create spontaneously through that technique. And we have, unfortunately, far too many artists off on the other side of the picture who are all inspiration and no technique. If you enjoy poetry, for example, I mentioned Keats. Despite the fact that he died at the age of 25, the man was a master of poetic meter. He understood poetry throughout, had read all of Shakespeare and Milton and all this stuff. In other words, he knew his craft. Poets today who are 50, 60 years old, haven't read the stuff, they don't know the rhyme pattern, they just figure that if they can arrange it in such a way that the structure looks nice, it's good enough. Very unfortunate. Beauty, permanence, truth, goodness, always involve balance. Now we split the waters again. And now we're down at the level of more physical things. Not quite completely physical yet, but the more coarse emotions, let's say. In the lecture that I gave on the astrology and the Sephiroth, I pointed out that these can be understood on the right side as Venus and on the left side as Mercury, which is a helpful way of thinking of them. They're also described as splendor and victory. The idea that I think is attempting to be conveyed here is that this polarity again, which we saw begin with the abstract conceptions of active and passive, move down into the more moral perceptions of a deity as being severe and merciful, come down here into something slightly different, which could be described as the sensual, or the emotional, or the nonverbal, and then the verbal aspect of activities. Now, let me make that a little bit clearer. The nonverbal would have to do with just general feelings. We all live in a world of feelings. These are just impressions that you get. Not sensations, not imagination. This is emotion. This is something primary to them. And in the Kabbalah, I might add, emotion is in a certain sense considered primary to thought. An example of this would be that some mornings you get up and you just feel melancholy, or you just feel good, or you just feel irritated, and there's no particular reason for it. You just have this overriding emotion. And then something happens in the environment, and you seize on it to say, this made me feel good, or this made me angry, that sort of thing. But there are these large emotions that can, for some of us, last weeks. They're like these great currents that move through our lives. And part of the effort of every mystic, of every person spiritually oriented, of any philosopher or psychologist, is to become aware of these emotions and to begin to work with them. So that if you feel melancholic, you find a positive way to channel that energy into something useful, so that the melancholy is discharged, you feel better, and you accomplish something as well. That sort of thing. But these overriding emotions are one aspect, and I would suggest to you that they have something to do with that mercy side. Not really, they're on the severe side, but they have to do with the passive aspect, because we are passive to these emotions. It's almost as if we're cups that contain them, and they flow in and out. Now, of course, a similar thing can be said of thought, except that thought in its purest form should be used and not using us. Big problem in our culture. We tend to be completely owned by our thinking mechanisms. We have these little plans we make up about how the world acts and how it should look, and then we apply everything we do to those plans, instead of simply living and paying attention and turning on the mind when we need it. As a result, we get into lots of trouble because the world is a lot smarter than we are. So this balance then between emotion and the mind, again, can be considered active in the sense that we use mind, but we're not really able to use emotions. You can learn to think. In Zen, you learn to shut off thought and to turn it on when you need it. You can learn to think clearly, logically. But emotions, the most you can really do is learn to be aware of them and to channel them. There's something a little bit vaguer about them. Not so much an instrument. Our polarity closes again. We wind up in Yesod, which is the moon world, the world of imagination. And this includes the sensory world. This is just sort of the overriding dream that we all exist in, this constant montage of images and perceptions and all this sort of thing that's almost like a cocoon or an aura in which we live. If you think of the aura as a magnetic egg around you, you might think of your impressions of the world. I mean, all this right now, the voice, the people around you, the colors, as being within that egg, being impressions that you have consciousness of. That's the world of imagination. And of course that also has to do with the arts and such things, because when you begin to formulate the archetypes that exist in your experience of the world into archetypal situations, in other words, when they begin to teach in a very luminous, basic way that's quite obvious to people in the particular culture, you have great art. And finally, we get down to Malkuth, which would be understood as the physical body, or the most physical, or the lowest frequency, the lowest vibration, the most material aspect of your experience of life. This is, in a sense, the feet of clay, and Kether is the head of gold, if you know your Bible. If not, then it sounded like complete nonsense. Now, we're going to go to a brief elucidation of how this has to do with the chakras. I am not suggesting that the Hebrews trained the Hindus or vice versa. What I am suggesting is that it's quite suggestive in itself that there are 7 levels on this tree, and that there are 7 levels in our present understanding of the chakras. One thing I need to point out immediately, though, is that in the actual Hindu tradition, there's all kinds of different numbers. 4 is the most common one. 6 is next most common, and then comes 7, but I'll explain that to you. The reason that you find 4 is because the bottom 2 chakras are considered physical. Therefore, they are not of interest to a spiritually motivated yogi. The reason that you have 6 instead of 7 is because if you are aware of your chakra system, you have heard that there are 2 chakras in the head area, one associated with the pineal and the other with the pituitary. And the idea is that one is passive and the other is active and this sort of thing. In most of the systems, the pineal chakra is depicted as the leaves of the 1,000-petaled lotus. It is not considered a chakra in itself, and so that drops it down yet another. However, we're going to consider this as 7. So we'll begin at the bottom now, going up the tree, as I promised earlier. And we begin with the body and the lowest chakra. The lowest chakra corresponds to, roughly in the body, the anal region, and is associated with the expulsion of dead matter, of waste, of things that are no longer useful. Very interesting image of the body, because the body is a kind of continual snake skin. As I touch these things, I'm just leaving all sorts of cellular structures all over everything. The body, just in a sense, constantly is giving off of itself and reproducing. So, for instance, every 7 years, they tell us, our entire cellular and skeletal structure changes because the cells are constantly reproduced. And so the person who stands before you now is a different person than the person who might stand before you 7 years from now. I may look quite the same because the overall hologram, as I like to see it, or logic of my appearance is set, but the cells are different. So the body then can be understood as a structure built on death. The Hindus refer to the body as being connected with Shiva, and they say that Shiva's dance is the heartbeat. You may have seen that beautiful statue of Shiva that we had at the LA County. The idea is that the body is an ephemeral collection of matter in which it serves like a kind of cocoon for our experience, and then falls away. And it's always falling away. Death is not then something that happens to us, but is something that happens to us every moment. It doesn't happen at a certain time, and that's death. We're dying all the time, and new influx of life is keeping us here. When we decide from higher up not to send in any more influx of life, then we have what we call death. That is, the body does not regenerate any longer. So that's the lowest level. And you can see that's why it's considered to be physical and beneath the notice of the Hindu yogi. There's not much you can do with it. You just keep it in good shape, keep it kind of stretched, get plenty of sleep, eat well, that sort of thing, and that's it. Next level has to do with the sexual regions, the reproductive organs, and is also considered a purely physical chakra, and it's considered to be the dimensional point, if you like, from which the ability to reproduce comes from. This is the human ability, or an animal's or whatever, to pass on its life force into being separate from itself. So this can be understood as the creative impulse in a physical level. It can be understood also as all the ecstatic experiences having to do with sexuality are, in a sense, the kindling of the flame at that point, and then it comes ripping up the rest of the tree. We'll talk about that in greater detail in a moment or two. But the real point is that we're getting a little bit less material here. As we're shown in the Kabbalah, the bottom is the 4 elements and is physical, whereas the next is the imagination, yesod, or a sky sphere, as it's called. And the idea here is that the sexual part of our experience is very much connected to the spiritual. The reason that it's called a physical chakra by so many Hindus is because so many Hindus feel that you should not involve your sexual practice with your spiritual practice. Most Hindu schools advocate celibacy. There are, however, other schools, the Tantric in particular, that tell you, no, on the contrary, sex is the best way to approach these things, And as a result, they do use the chakra, pointing out that when you concentrate the energy of sexual appetite, you activate, if you know what you're doing, all the chakras all the way up until you have a full-blown mystical experience. Needless to say, this is not something to play around with, but it is simpler than most people make it out to be. Most tantric practice involves all kinds of weird sexuality and all sorts of ritualistic uses, and I would suggest that any orgasm is the thousand-petal lotus experience on a certain level, and that it's really much simpler than it seems. It's not necessary to get involved in any bizarre ritualistic aspects to appreciate that a normal attitude towards sexuality is a very important boon in spiritual development. We move from there to what are definitely called spiritual chakras. And I should mention, I guess, just for those of you who may not know, what is meant by chakra is a Sanskrit word meaning wheel. Spiral is a good image. And the Hindus believe that we have this physical body. This physical body has its blood vessels and its nerves. But there's more to it than meets the eye. There is something called the etheric body, which is the body of vital energies. It's kind of the bridge between spirit and matter. And then there's the actual Atman, or spiritual center, or spiritual self. And the idea is that the spiritual energy that goes into the body goes into it through a tremendous network of little vessels that really aren't material. They're, let's say, put it this way, they are less material than immaterial. So they're barely knowable. These are the very same kinds of things that are used by acupuncturists who try to learn the different positions and then sense them by their electrical presences. The chakras are a kind of, if you imagine the various spiritual cores passing through your body as freeways, the chakras are the big cities. They're where everything happens. And they are also connected with the glandular ganglia, the nervous system, and the idea is it's through them that your life is influenced, given its spiritual energies, its life, its vitality, and even some say the very experience of life is channeled through the chakras. And so, depending on which chakra you focus most on, that will be your world. And just using the two examples that I've done so far, you start out with the bottom. You may know some people who are totally body-centered, who are bitter, death-obsessed, melancholic, very into the idea of the darkness of things. We saw a great deal of this after the two world wars, particularly in that area. The arts, the literature was full of this terrible despair and the sense that humanity was nothing but fungus, that we were completely a useless creation, self-destructive and incomprehensible. That attitude, on a certain level, can be understood as focusing too much on the lowest chakra. The next level up, the sexual, this would be much more popular in our culture today. These are the swingers. These are people who have a great time, and all they're interested in is pleasure and sexuality and that sort of thing, and don't want any commitments. And that place, and this is, by the way, I should add, going further than mere sexual enjoyment. This is going all the way to the degree of your classic rock singer is a good example. I have babies all over the country, and they love the idea. It's just sort of reproduction, that kind of thing. So you can focus on that level too. This is the gentleman who feels that because he has 25 children, he is a success in life. The other person down in the lowest chakra cannot be a success in life because he believes there is no success in life. Life is not success, it is despair. Now the next level up are our stomach people, because we're now dealing with the stomach chakra. Now, this is a very important chakra because in some Hindu traditions it's considered to be the sun itself. And if you have ever practiced any Tai Chi, you know that the shir, the spiritual energy, is passing up from here. You're supposed to be able to move from this center in here. And if you think about it, particularly if you are a gastronomically interested person, there is a great deal to be said about the way that the consumption of food gives you this sense of well-being, of kind of radiation almost, this very Jupiterian feeling of expansiveness and all that sort of thing. So this would be, in a sense, people who, could be understood as people who just like to have things. They like to feel good in that way. They're not so much interested in the sexual energies. They certainly don't think that life is despairing, But they do like to have their possessions, their wealth. They like to be kind of ensconced and always have nice full bellies and feel good that way. Now, if you think about the fact that having a full belly is a prerequisite of survival, you can see that this is an extremely important point in the human being. You have no control over the bottom chakra. I mean, it does what it wants to do. The death aspect of your life happens without your consciousness and your personality too much involved. The sexual part, you can not reproduce. You can be impotent or choose not to and never have children and still live a fine life. But if you don't eat, you're dead. So we're now at a different level. We're now talking about something that is an absolute necessity and can be understood as the principle of sustenance in human life. You must eat. You must consume life. You must consume energy in order to survive. You have to rebuild your material structure from it as well as your life force. And so this chakra is involved with breaking down the things that you eat in order to restructure them into your body. It's very important. It's kind of we'll go back to our freeway analogy and say that these are the fellows who keep the freeway running. They keep it repaired and that sort of thing. This is all activity, then, that has to do with self-preservation. It can be understood to be centered at that place in that particular chakra. Now let's pause for a minute and point out the correspondences here in the Kabbalah. So first we have the death area of life, the constant turmoil of life and death. It's not really turmoil, it's a harmony of life and death that makes up bodily experience, and that has to do with Malkuth, the kingdom. That is the most physical part in the Kabbalah of the tree of life. We move up to Yesod, or the imagination, the lunar sphere, and this is associated with sexual generation. Very interesting thing, very interesting, that most of the sexual cults in India, and also the romantic cults of the troubadour, most of the romantics period, love moon symbology. So it's quite interesting that there is this correspondence in the Kabbalah between these levels, and it also exists in our history and in our literature. Then you move up to the next level, which we talked about as having to do with thought and emotion. And that here corresponds to the stomach chakra. Now this is very interesting because in the Bible, which has been badly translated out of the Aramaic, generally when you hear about the heart, they're talking about the stomach, because the Semitic people at that time did not say, I've got a great idea. The ideas were here. The emotions were down here. It was all centered down in the stomach area. So they had a very different way of viewing the body than we do, and viewing it as a center of experience. So really the idea of thought and emotion corresponds then very well to the stomach area chakra, abdominal chakra, because if you really think about it, if you're a scholar, when you get hungry, you can push it to a certain degree. There's no question about it. You can work on your work until you're absolutely passing out with hunger. But you do reach a point where you are going to eat, no matter what you want to do. And if you're a dedicated artist, you well know the terrible experience of really being right in there, creating something you love, and if you can just finish it, and you start to get lightheaded because you're too hungry, and you start making mistakes, and you realize, no way. Got to learn self-discipline, give up a little earlier, and come back to it, that sort of thing. And also emotions come in from there, because you can be absolutely heartbroken about the lover who broke your heart, and you don't eat anything for a long time, and all of a sudden you get giddy and you get a stomach ache and you eat. And lover slips away for a little while completely. So, very important aspect here. In a way, we can say that it is from the level of self-preservation that thought and emotion reach expression. So, think about that. Very important. If you advocate a philosophy that is against self-preservation, you're in big trouble unless you can prove to somebody that it really has to do with self-preservation. Example, Jesus, Gandhi, telling people to turn the other cheek, even fast, be celibate, that sort of thing. But you will note that in the face of that, which sounds like lack of self-preservation, they say, because your life down here is meaningless, and by doing this you preserve your real life, which is spiritual. And people who buy that, who believe in it, who know it, those people practice it because they realize this is a truer form of self-preservation. On the other hand, people who say, oh, I don't know about that spiritual stuff, they're very seldomly really Christian, or for that matter, really followers of Gandhi. So self-preservation is very much connected with thought and emotion. The next level up in the chakra is our heart chakra, and that's Sephiroth. Beautiful image here. Beauty, self-expression coming out of the heart, and astrologically speaking, Sephiroth is known as the sun. So we have an association in imagery between the heart and the sun. And the idea is, in another school of Hinduism, that yes, your thoughts and your emotions come from your stomach, but that is not the center of your life. You are not centered in self-preservation because, as Buddhism shows through its Yataka tales, it is possible to give up your life for somebody else quite consciously. Your life is centered in your heart, in your expression of self, that sort of thing, in what you find beautiful. I think it's quite a beautiful image, actually. But that particular chakra is connected with the artist or the businessman, the politician, whoever is attempting to create something visible to others, whoever is attempting to express their feelings about the world, about themselves, about some detail to other human beings in a way that will move them, that will affect them in any way whatsoever. Any form of expression, then, is connected with that chakra. Now, interestingly, I might add this is not the means of expression, but the desire for it. Very interesting to note that what we're dealing with here, first of all, is the cross of matter on this first 4 levels. And the suggestion would be that it is at this level that the worldly, the material aspect of human life stops. And we're now going to start to enter the mystical or spiritual levels, which we'll do at the second half of this lecture. But to further point that out, you can have an artist, a businessman, any form of creator who is not spiritually motivated. You can be quite good at what they do. Their interest is materially oriented. They have fun in what they do. They enjoy it, or they make good money at it, or they get attention from it, whatever. But they do not have to have a spiritual orientation from it. The use of the next chakras definitely involves some form of spiritual orientation. On the other hand, it is not possible to divide the chakras that way. They are all active in a lesser or greater manner in each other. So, for example, we were talking earlier about the sexual act, and you can point out very, very simply that although the desire to reproduce is down here in the second chakra, the desire for self-expression and pleasure is also connected up in the 4th chakra. The 3rd chakra is also connected because it's involving emotion and thought. And emotion and thought are polarities in sexuality. Now, to illustrate how this works, an invariant in sexual experience is this desire for reproduction in its purest sense. Now, that means not necessarily that you have to be wanting to make love in order to make babies. It means simply that sexual energy has the intensity that it has because it involves the survival, the sustenance of the human race. Now, whether you are giving expression to that sustenance or not, generally you have an element at work there that is. And an example of this is 2 things. First of all, birth control methods always leave you wondering. And there's that element involved. And there are some people who experience that wondering as a great delight. They get twice as much fun out of sexual experience when the person involved is not using some form of contraceptive as when they are. There's a kind of danger involved. Seems more intense that way. That's because that chakra is coming out even stronger. And there's also going to be this self-expressive beingness kind of experience. Just the letting go of all these different worlds of self in the primal experience of sexuality. But you've got this polarity at work, too, of emotion and thought. There are people who get too emotional with their sexuality, and as a result, they do not enjoy it. They're frightened by it, they maybe are too expectant, those kinds of things, those kinds of emotions. And on the other hand, there are people who think too much about it and don't enjoy it. They say things like, that's disgusting, I want to think about it, just that sort of thing. So you need a balance for it to work properly. If it is not working properly, a gate shuts. And what you have is sexuality as reproduction, period. Getting up to the level of self-expression and enjoyment is not possible until the emotions and thought patterns are balanced. We're going to stop there, and then we'll continue on up the tree and up the chakras. So a brief break.
My name is Art Johnson. I was assisting Ron with some of the lectures on the Kabbalah, and I work here and also do other lectures from time to time. I'm also a musician and a budding poet. And we had a real nice experiment on a lecture Ron and I split called Magic in the Kabbalah, whereby I brought my Renaissance lute, and after discussing some of the ramifications of transcendental magic in the Kabbalah, I explained that music was used in some of the prophetic meditations of the early Kabbalists. So I did a little experiment, and I played a few Elizabethan Renaissance lute pieces and asked everybody in the audience to write a small quatrain. And we got some great poems, I'll have to say. But it was really nice to see that one of the people who's a regular attendant here, Lee Brooks, came to me a couple of weeks later and said, gee, I think I've written a poem. I don't know. Would you take a look at it? And I said, I would love to. So we took a look at it, and it was 2 haiku poems with some prose in the middle, and I merely took the prose in the middle and restructured it architecturally, and I said, you have a complete poem here. So he brought it in restructured tonight and showed it to Ron, and Ron said, I insist that you read the poem. Ron and I have been reading poems on the break because we started it and everybody liked it. No one said, please go home, so we've kept it up. But instead of Ron and I starting this evening, I would like Mr. Lee Brooks to come up, Dr. Brooks as it is, and read his poem. I think it's just wonderful. Lee, would you please do that?
You know, what Ron didn't tell you is when I approached him a couple of weeks ago, I said, I wrote something. I wrote a poem. I said, I'd like to show it to you, but I'm ashamed to show it to you because you're a poet, And so he says, Lee, that's the first stupid thing I've ever heard you say. So I said, okay, go ahead, look at it. Anyway, here's what I have. I recently came back from Japan, and I was asked to give a talk at a church about my impressions, since I was the only one in the group who was there for the first time. So I did, and then the lady in charge of, she's a travel agent in charge of the trips, she said, Lee, I'd love you to write this up, a particular section of my talk. So I said, well, okay. So I wrote it mostly in prose, but Art convinced me to convert it. Okay, good deed. Okay, it's entitled The Fall Pilgrimage to Japan. After Hakone, after the sacred grounds, within myself, walking up a landscaped hill in Hakone, at the sacred grounds, I came upon a fork in the path. I had to choose which path to take. My eyes, they spoke to me, fixed upon a planting in the center, sounding its tune, it caressed me. It gently and sweetly guided and escorted me up the hill into the mountains and beyond. Into the white, fluffy clouds I merged with the sky. The sky, the mountains, the trees and I were one. The experience whispered to me, thee, we, the universe within myself.
Having divine precognitive powers, I also brought an Oriental-oriented poem, knowing he would show up tonight. This is a form that I think I've developed, I'm not sure. I won't bore you with how I came up. It's called the chameleon form. It's in free verse, but after I read the entire poem, there's a separate poem from the first line of every verse and a separate poem from the last line of every verse that also relates to the original poem, but are separate poems. I think that's confusing enough, so here we go. Chameleon. Buddha sailed, his loose robe fixed with dangling saints. Westerly winds sang across white-nippled waves. Mad ones stay with God, only their bodies fall to earth. Buddha smiled. Strips of timber creaked, echoing through the hull, bound homeward. In my courtyard lives a banana tree. One leaf yellows and reddens, dying yet resplendent. The banana tree stands silent. Why has the wind died? Where are the storm clouds? Their cold, violent marriage comforted. I am lucky, entering a warm room after a walk in the rain. Now that's the entire poem. The first line of each verse reads, Buddha sailed westerly winds. Buddha smiled. In my courtyard, the banana tree stands silent. The last line of each verse, dangling saints, only their bodies fall to earth, bound homeward, yet resplendent, after a walk in the rain.
And now, a poem. This is called November Rainstorm. Every instant drops collect, ropes of them fall, vivid in the cone cast by a streetlight. Blue night, so wet, ornamented with a gleam and patter of water dripping down. The wind hurls freshness. I've opened the window to a wave that crashes on the shore of books and serene carvings. All turn aquatic, exotic fish motionless in an instant's flow. A driver honks outside. 3 quick blasts to clear the way. The Trinity exclaimed. Sirens spin spirals into darkness, but the world remains enfolded in its triple curtain of night, rain, and silence. One day the buildings, cars, and busy humans will vanish. Primary silence will reign, a sun incandescent in the profound stillness of inner space. Emptiness. How I feared that resonant word. But emptiness embraces fullness and gives it joy and a flash of perfection. Fullness is only a limit that touches emptiness and swoons, ecstatic with freedom. Moment by moment, emptiness bears fullness on its back. Moment by moment, 10,000 drops appear from emptiness and disappear into it again. What is this stuff called emptiness? Everything outside, the line drawn by busy human senses to keep the world manageable and separate from God. So, we were at the top of our cross, which was the material perspective of the chakras, and we were about to cross over into the spiritual. And as you may remember, we had covered the anal, sexual, stomach, and heart chakras. So now we're going to move up into a more whimsical area in a certain sense. And the next one we find is a polarity again, and this is the throat chakra. Very interesting point here, because what we're dealing with is the idea of letting things out and letting things in. You allow nourishment to come in through your mouth, and you allow words to go out, which is often the bigger problem of the two. If you think about it then, this active-passive polarity becomes instantly visible in the function of the throat. But let's think about it instead as a dynamic principle. And that is that this chakra has to do with the things that you let into your world and the things that you keep out. Now, this is very much a mental phenomenon, and it's quite proper that this chakra is particularly involved with the idea of communication. The emotions may be understood as being a kind of pre-tuning underneath your ideas of things, but you could also argue that there is a deeper kind of reason at work in the human personality. In other words, that first you've got the level of normal thought, the chatter in your mind, moment by moment. Then you've got the level of emotion, which has a great deal of control over that chatter. But you have another level of thought that you seldom contact, way down deep, that can be understood as your world view, the assumptions, the principles that you have. Now, one extremely important fact is this. Whatever your principles are, in order to be happy, you must see them and live them, whatever they are. The moment that you begin to move away from your principles you become unhappy. If you do not know what your principles are, then you must begin to examine yourself for them. And when you discover them, no matter how painful they might be, such a thing as, I cannot continue to own a VCR as long as there are starving people or whatever, you must put into effect, you must act on that principle. That's where happiness comes from. Important point, your principles, not somebody else's, not mine, not Mahatma Gandhi's, nobody's but yours. And you really don't have the right to promulgate your principles to other people by trying to force them or by trying to shake them up into accepting your principles as being better. All you can do is this. You can encourage them to live their principles in the best, most complete way they can, and to continually be examining their principles, to see if you can refine, purify them. If you begin to do this, if you really begin to think about what's important in life, you may begin to think that your principles are changing. They're not. What's really happening is that they're refining, they're purifying, they're becoming simpler and more luminous. And what happens when you do that is the continuum between the action on principle and then taking the results of the action and subjecting the principle to those results and thus trying to clarify the principle begins to produce what's called a spiritual path. And eventually you find principles that are adamantine. They just stand against all obstacles and give you tremendous strength, tremendous power. The Indians talk about the warrior in that way, and the Chinese, in a more mild sense, talk about living in the Tao. But that's life where your principles and your actions agree, and your principles are the best that you can find. You've just dug in there and tried to find every way that you're fooling yourself, or that you've been fooled by others. That deeper level of reason that in a sense can be said to control your emotions about things. In an example, for instance, like, well, let's say there's a particular kind of food you find disgusting. You just absolutely can't stand it until somebody explains it to you. They say, oh, well, really, all this is such and such, and it's kind of like that. And sometimes when people tell you what something means or how it works, your disgust vanishes. You say, really? And you feel foolish. If this isn't happening to you all the time, you need to work harder on your path. Because believe me, there's plenty of stuff out there for you to discover you're wrong about. And it's a good exercise to look for those things in your personality and to ask yourself, well, how could they be enjoyable? So, for example, if you hate sushi, you don't have to go out and eat it, but you might think about what things people find appealing about it. And if you practice this all the time, you get a sense of universality that's a lot better than this kind of emotional trigger reaction. So this inner part corresponds to the throat chakra, because this is, in a sense, the language by which you communicate with your world. That's a very subtle point. This is not the words that you use or the English language, but is instead, it's like the rules of grammar, the nouns, the objects, and the verbs, the actions that you continually live your life in. Each of us decides there are certain actions, certain verbs we will not use, certain things we will not do, and that is gone from our language. There are certain nouns, certain objects we will not allow into our lives. That's struck from the language. There are certain whole rules, grammatical usages we will not allow. So, for example, a materialistic scientist, when confronted by a mystic who says, well, I'll tell you, in my belief system, I think that Albert Einstein was sort of a medium more than anything else. I mean, he was a fellow who kind of wandered around Princeton with no idea whether he'd eaten or not, and he just got these brilliant ideas that were not based on education, but on exploration. And I call genius spiritual inspiration. And not only that, but I've experienced it in my life. I've proved it to my satisfaction. A good scientist will say, poop! No way. Now, what does that mean? A whole grammatical rule struck from the language, a whole way of being gone from that person's life. And just as a grammatical rule is a very useful way to express ourselves, so also when we strike these living rules from our lives, we cripple ourselves, we make ourselves less complete. So this is in a sense a little speech about open-mindedness. If you don't believe it, Do not say, I know it isn't so, period. Say, I am agnostic about it. I don't know. And be prepared to admit the possibility that you can find out about it, because there's a terrific irony in all this stuff. If you want to understand mysticism, if you want to understand the spiritual experience, you absolutely have to admit its possibility. Terrible problem, because most scientists, most materialistically oriented people, most intellectuals will say, well, that's wrong. I mean, why can't I understand it without experiencing it? Well, there's certain things you cannot understand without experiencing them. A very simple example, since we touched the subject earlier, is sexuality. I can talk to you blue in the face about what it feels like and what you do and this and that, but if you haven't experienced it, you don't know what I'm talking about. It's just that simple. You may think you do. Same thing with mysticism. So if you're going to discover whether it's true or not, you have to at least suspend disbelief and be open to being surprised. This is true actually of just about every realm of human life, because it's definitely true of science. I can illustrate it out of my own life. I never liked science when I was growing up and refused to believe in its principal tenets, and as a result never got anywhere in it. Never had any reason to believe it because I refused the basics it was built on. Later on in life I rediscovered it and began to enjoy it and kind of studied my way back into the 20th century. But the point is that even something as apparently without emotional content as science is closed to you if you disbelieve what you're being told. Just that simple. Same thing true of mysticism. So up here you decide whether to choke or open. And that's that chakra. And on the tree, that is splendor and victory. That is the experience of severity and mercy even more powerfully. So you can be severe with your world or some aspect of it, and you can be merciful with an aspect of your world. The idea is to be balanced, because if you are all merciful, like our erstwhile New Ager we mentioned earlier, you're letting everything in. It's great. And as a result, you're getting awfully confused. You have to have some discrimination. You must be able to tell what is truth and what isn't, what you need to practice at a certain point and what you don't need to practice, who you need to be around, who you don't need to be around. Those are very important. But on the other hand, if you focus entirely on discrimination, you don't learn anything new, you don't change, you don't open. None of the channels get flowing. So you've got to balance that, and that's the throat chakra. Then we move up, next step. Now these would be the leaves of the 1,000-petaled lotus, which we'll get to last. And that chakra is associated with something that goes beyond these reasonable assumptions, something that could be understood as, well, it's psychic vision of a certain type. If you think of psychic vision as being separate from your daily life, not at all true. Psychic vision is constantly with us. We call it by different words, however. All of us have sudden understandings. They call it a gestalt in certain schools of psychology, where all of a sudden we see how it all fits together. The mandala becomes vividly apparent to us in our lives. That is a psychic experience. In other words, it's seeing of a higher order. That's all. It's seeing through instead of seeing the surface. So, for example, I could perhaps, if I so cared, astound somebody in the audience by telling you all about yourself. And the way I would do it is by looking at the clothes you're wearing, your posture, the expression on your face, the way you have responded to certain things I have said, and the way you respond to the things I tell you as I'm explaining who you are. Now you may say, that's psychic, but it isn't. It's seeing. And the amazing thing is, as you do that, you suddenly discover you have more information than you thought. This is what an astrologer does. An astrologer sits down and begins to use the tools that he or she understands, but then all of a sudden, other things start flying in. It's as if, as soon as the consciousness goes into an open state, more information than the mentality by itself can produce becomes available. Just that simple. And that is psychic experience. It has nothing to do with any particularly fancy aspect of the human makeup. It's simply part of the great reservoir of energies, of consciousness that we have, and it's bringing more of that into effect. Illustration, a great artist is an artist who is selfless, who lets go, who learns all the techniques, does all the studying, all that stuff, but when it comes down to writing a poem, when that tug comes, just lets everything go. Doesn't get in there and say, oh, I can't say that because people will think I'm that sort of thing. None of that gets in there. It's just the poem has to be captured in its own being, in its own completeness. That's true of a painting, a business, anything at all you're putting together. The more selfless it is, if you've done your homework, the better it is. And all the great artists, the really great artists, leave us those little remarks like, I didn't do it. I just suddenly saw what had to happen and furiously tried to capture it, and I wasn't even there, it seemed. It was almost like a trance state. You hear that all the time. And that's this kind of psychic vision. Now, the Hindus tell us that this is very much involved. This is like separated only by the thinnest membrane from the thousand-petaled lotus. Just that close. The thousand-petaled lotus corresponds to the top of the tree or Kether. You will recall that is the place where God touches you and you live from that point. The image of a thousand-petaled lotus is great. I point out that Dante, his great heavenly rose, same thing. All these angels and lights spinning around in spirals and all this stuff. And this is the same concept, the thousand-petaled lotus. And I might add that if you know your Dante, it's very much a little trip up the spinal column. You start down at the way at the bottom, not where you start, but where, in a sense, the hell has its lowest point. We have old Satan frozen in the ice, and that corresponds to the lowest chakra, the very Saturnian death kind of quality, inertia. And then you get all the way up to these incredible, like, flower of angels and light that surrounds God and goes on infinitely inward toward God. Same thing as the Kundalini, whether this is because Dante had a spiritual guru, which is very unlikely, or simply because he had this kind of experience and recorded it in the available language is not for us to know. Some feel that he was a Rosicrucian and that he laid down their version of the Kundalini experience. They were definitely in touch with the Sufis, and the Sufis were definitely in touch with the Hindus, so it's possible that it passed that way. But at any rate, the important thing is that the image of a thousand-petaled lotus can best be understood by, imagine that each petal is made up of light, of consciousness, of being. And to the Hindus, 1,000 means infinite. So it is a petal of infinite, it's a lotus of infinite petals. And all these petals are consciousness, or worlds. And if you go a little bit further, you will note that all these petals make this kind of scalloped thing. And the Hindus have this belief that that's the form of life in the world. All things have this cycle. It starts up here, way up in spirit, descends down in a kind of U pattern into matter, and then starts to ascend back up towards spirit. And they say that your trail of incarnations goes like that. You go down, 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 and then you start going up again. Same thing they say the human race does as a whole. Same thing they say planets and universes do. They begin at a certain level of energy, they become grosser, more material, and then they begin to refine again. And the idea is that as they become grosser, they externalize aspects of themselves, which they then become aware of, they learn how to use as instruments, and then they go back up where they were, now having those instruments intact and useful. It's a rather beautiful image. So even that's included in the petal of this infinite petaled lotus. It's also an excellent description of what might be called cosmic consciousness or the mystical experience, that sort of thing. There's very few descriptions that work for this. Inner light, fire, the rosy cross, the thousand-petaled lotus, all mean the same thing. The rosy cross, symbol of the Rosicrucians, is not some little, golden cross with a rose on it. That's not the idea. It's a description of a mystical experience that has to do with golden radiance and a kind of rosy effulgency in the center of it. It's a very beautiful kind of an experience that these people had, and a Rosicrucian was a person who had it. It was really just about that simple. That was the Rosicrucian initiation. The fire, the inner sun, I think is really the best image in certain ways. It's the least intellectual. There's not much you can do with it. But it really describes the intensity of the experience. Because when you have it, what happens very basically is that this dimension of experience, what you call waking life, effaces, it flattens. And all you're aware of suddenly is this tremendously powerful, radiant consciousness that is you. And your one thought, the last thing you think, in a sense, when you pass into that state is, how could I have been so convinced that this other stuff was real? It's so colorless, so flat. And you just sense this tremendous freedom and power, consciousness. And as you come down out of it, begin to normalize a little bit, you're left with the impression that you have, in a sense, entered a blazing sun, and that that blazing sun is you. Some people say that blazing sun is God, and this is that kind of mystical experience, but I would suggest that you've gone into what might be called the higher or over-self. That's Kether. That's the thousand-petaled lotus. That experience has been well recorded, well, not really well, but pretty well recorded by a fellow by the name of Buck in a book called Cosmic Consciousness. He was a friend of Walt Whitman's. And Whitman had this experience several times, and so did many other people of that time. And Buck was so struck by this, he actually happened to him at one point. He went and talked to Whitman for a long time, and one day he was in a carriage in the rain, and suddenly he just had this tremendous mystical experience called Cosmic Consciousness. And he felt, I've got to write down a book and record through history different people's impressions of what this was like. And so you have Dante in there, and you've got Shakespeare and Bacon in there, and you've got all these great famous figures, and their own words, Balzac, talking about the same experience of cosmic consciousness. It's a very dramatic thing. It is not, however, the goal of spiritual development. Extremely important lesson that the tree gives us is that, yes, that is in a sense the penultimate experience that you can have in the body. The question is, though, what do you do with it? It forever changes your perception of life. It tends to eliminate the fear of death, that sort of thing, which changes you pretty drastically, actually. You may not realize how much until you've gone through it. But what do you do with it? I've had many people who showed up here at a lecture and afterwards told me they had to tell me something. And then what they told me was that they had a mission from God that was based on this experience and this sort of stuff. And the experience was a very simple, mystical experience that any normal human being can have once they open themselves to it. Badly misunderstood. Big problem. Culture isn't very aware of these kinds of experiences. And they are not useful unless you bring them down to earth. If you run around telling people, I have seen God. Yes. Well, he exists. Yes. Then you got to start to dig up things to tell them. Well, you've got to change this or that. And that takes a different kind of intelligence. The prophets themselves, as a matter of fact, some legitimate Kabbalists tell us, discuss their revelations in terms of 2 degrees. The first thing that happened was, wham, you had the experience, this kind of cosmic experience. Next thing that happened is you were left with these pictures. And they all pointed out, if you didn't know what the pictures meant, if you hadn't developed your intellect, you were out of luck. Because all you had was a bunch of nonsensical pictures. You had to know what the pictures meant in terms of the real world. And the idea of the Kabbalah here is that you must connect Kether with Malkuth. You must bring it all the way down. And that's when you have really begun to practice the spiritual path. What that means is much less complex than it might sound. It can sound a little bit overpowering. But actually the means to developing the wisdom to use this experience and the means of getting the experience are one and the same. Isn't that handy? And it's simply this. It's the practice of what might be called spiritual alchemy, the practice of balancing. It's the practice of finding your vices, your faults, simple, daily ones, not big, fancy ones with Latin names, but stuff that you have to face every day. Moodiness, irritability, melancholy, those kinds of things. You deal with them day by day and you transmute each one. You learn to be kinder. You learn to listen. You learn to see. All that kind of thing. The other day, I had a most interesting experience to illustrate this. We're very near to Thanksgiving now, and if you're seasonally aware, or if you have a family that demands that you notice such things, you have already felt the Thanksgiving spirit in the air. If you happen to be a lover of what America represents, although it seems to be perverting it right now, but nevertheless the founding principles of the country, then you have even stronger feelings about this particular season. And I had the rather melancholy experience of seeing, which I might add I transmuted into a poem, of seeing a woman, dumb woman, very poor, who had her child with her in the rain, maybe a 2-year-old baby, something like that, and was standing by the outside of a bank, waving around a little piece of paper. I imagine what was on the paper was an explanation about why she had to beg. And I watched all these people in line in front of me take money out of the bank. And they were all prosperous people. They all looked good. You know, their sweaters on and their ties and all this kind of stuff. And you know what? Not one of them even saw this woman. We're talking studious ignorance here. I mean, eyes forward. Terrible pity. Terrible pity. Not for the woman, but for them. Because the experience they would have had they had a bit of an encounter with this woman, would have been very, very good for them. And they may think they're getting away with it. They may think, well, I didn't see, but they did see. Because way up there, the overself says, bad, 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 bad. And it later comes out in your life. You have to deal with that aspect of yourself. Now, the reason I bring that up is because it wouldn't surprise me in the least if we didn't have some spiritual masters in that group of people who went driving right past this woman. Because, unfortunately, a great many people on the spiritual path don't think of it in those terms. They say, oh, yes, I'm diligently searching for enlightenment, and I want to convey my knowledge of the upper 12 dimensions of the psychic states to all humanity so they will have the creative freedom that I do. Meanwhile, there are people starving and homeless right down the street. Now, Jesus and Buddha gave us some pretty good examples that way. You cannot take them particularly to the degree that they did if you like, but certainly you have to be aware of that element in your spiritual path. And if somebody pops up in your path, that's the most important thing. In other words, do not go searching for the troubles. There are people who are tuned that way, and they know who they are. They're not even here probably. They're out doing it. But for most of us on a spiritual path, the concern needs to be with people who are right in front of us. If you walk down the street and you see someone begging, you see someone homeless, it is your responsibility as a spiritually oriented person to do something, whether it be hand over enough money to make a difference, whatever it happens to be that you have, or whether it be to invite them to a meal if you so feel, or to give them a blanket or a coat or whatever it is that you can do at that moment. Generally what happens when you see the person, if you don't immediately clamp down and say, no way, not for me, is some idea does hit you in the mind. Later on you say, oh, I should have done this, or I should have done more, I should have done less, or whatever. But at the moment, an idea will hit your mind, do it. That's all your responsibility. Don't need to go out searching, but it's the direct one-on-one thing, and it's the way that you do it. If you have the opportunity, watch how people will, when they give money to the needy, watch how they do it. And you will understand certain sections of the New Testament very well. Because they tend to do it in this very kind of debonair fashion. You know, they feel great about themselves. And the person says, oh, God bless you, and this sort of thing. I got news for you. The person who should be blessing is the one giving the money. Because if you're a believer in karma and the spiritual path, I assure you that every person who passes by you, who you have the opportunity to help and don't, is another little pennyweight on you that you have to take care of. Because in the end, when you have to go on upstairs and deliver a reckoning to yourself of how you dealt with this particular lifetime, you may think you're going to be able to go up there and say, well, I read Godfrey Higgins' Anacalypsis, and I read The Secret Teachings of All Ages, and I read Isis Unveiled. I read all that stuff. And I practiced meditation for 10 years, did a little bit of yoga, some Tai Chi, and I controlled my temper. And then all of a sudden, the powers that be say, well, that's nice. Now, what about this starving person, and that homeless person, and that needy person? But what? It wasn't my responsibility. They were in front of you, and you didn't do anything. And you can't plead ignorance. You can't say, well, hey, I was brought up to find my own way through life. You can't say that, because if you're on the spiritual path, you've read over and over and over again. Everybody's your friend. Everybody's your neighbor. Everybody's God, that kind of stuff. Your responsibility. And that, I would suggest to you, is bringing Kether all the way down to Malkuth. That is the physical action that comes from enlightenment. Very dramatic kind of thing to experience. The Hindus used to love to depict this by having stories about how a particular deity, Vishnu usually, would pop down into the world and turn into a beggar. And then he would go walking around the village, and he would knock on the door looking for rice. And if you answered the door and said, "Oh, of course," brought him a little bit of rice, well, he kind of thought, "Oh, they're okay." And a little bit of blessings went your way. If, on the other hand, you said, "Please, come in," you treated them with respect and kindness and affection, and they joined the dinner table. And usually in these wonderful stories, either the husband or wife is not into this and is saying, "How dare you bring this person?" And then the virtuous one with whatever sex says, "Shh, shh, shh, this is godly, we have to act this way," that sort of thing. Well, that's when suddenly Vishnu, in the middle of the meal, shows himself and says, "Because of this, you and all your children will be enlightened for the end of time," that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's the one who says, "Hey, get out of here. I'm calling the police if you don't get out of here." And you know what happens to that one? Bad. First their life goes, and then they wind up reborn in hell about 50 times. That sort of thing. Now, the Hindus tend to exaggerate things, and they tend to try and make it big so you pay attention to it. But it's a good dynamic. It's an easy way to remember it. Not easy to practice. And don't feel a failure if you have thought about these things and have given a nickel instead of inviting somebody to dinner because that's the most you could do. If that's the most you could do, that's fine. Maybe it'll take another 10, 20, 30 years, maybe another lifetime before you can deal with it more effectively. But be aware of the need to do that. Very, very important. So, we've now gone all the way back up the tree, and we have shown how it corresponds in a certain sense to the chakra system. This means that we have come to my favorite part of the lecture, which is when I get to just roam around at will and point out different correspondences and useful little tidbits and such, which of course I've already been doing because I do that all the time when I'm lecturing. But now the structure changes a little bit. The interesting thing to point out here is that both systems, although they appear linear, are better understood as being spirals. So in other words, as I show you this, you can picture this as Jacob's ladder, and you've got to climb up it. But it's not really going like that. It's really spiraling up. And the chakra system should be understood as spirals too, and this is the reason. It is not really that we rise from chakra to chakra, from dimensional experience to dimensional experience. It's not really what happens. It's a spiraling kind of motion. You spiral up to something, you can spiral back down away from it. We get very confused because of this, because normally what happens to you on the mystical path is you have some form of experience you like, you understand something, and then, as a matter of course, you begin to feel a little bit of slippage. You feel a movement in a different direction. Most people will panic at that point because they will assume that they are now falling. Not necessarily. Very often what you are sensing as a kind of drop is simply a movement into another realm, another dimension of experience. Let me illustrate. Well, I wonder if I should draw this for you. I don't think so. Let's start down at the bottom. No, better yet, let's start in Yesod, the second one from the bottom, the second Sephiroth, the Sephiroth of imagination. You can move and conquer that area of life. You clarify your imagination for today. You never do it completely, but for today, you figured something out. You cleared up an illusion. You now see something more clearly in your imagination. Now, you'd like to stay there because you've had a success. You'd like to just, now I can keep the imagination going, but no, that's not what happens. You start to go, let's say, toward the tree of mercy now. In other words, you have to experience another part of things. You're no longer in the balanced state. You're now moving toward another realm of your existence, one that is more out on the extremity. And here you contact what might be called tests. In other words, experiences in life in which you apply your principles. Just that simple. If you're moving toward the mercy area, that might be something like unexpected good fortune. You balance yourself, your imagination is kind of humming along nicely, and suddenly the phone rings and you feel like the timing's perfect because you feel like talking, and you pick it up and somebody says, "I want to offer you such and such a job." And you think, great, that's the job I've been dying to get. A little bit of mercy. But how you deal with it is extremely important, because if you sit there and you start rubbing that pleasure, you start, boy, things are going great, and it's just because I'm practicing my spiritual stuff, and boy, I'm getting good. And a minute later, somebody comes into the room, a roommate or a spouse, and says something to you, and it's rather unenlightened, and you think, oh, poor thing, I'll have to really try and enlighten them, that sort of thing. Way off balance. Things get cluttered up again. On the other hand, you can go towards severity. You can have a severe experience. So once again, you've clarified your imagination, you see things clearly, you feel good about yourself, you're a real mystical kind of person, and all of a sudden you get in a car accident. You would be shocked at how many metaphysicians cease to be at that point. How many religious people cease to be at that point. They practice, and they give charity, and they do all this good stuff, and they get up and they lecture, and then they get in a car accident, and it's like, forget it, I didn't deserve that. I mean, there is no wisdom in the universe. That sort of thing just happens like that. You've got to be able to handle the severe things too. There's a lesson in there for you also. And if your reaction to a car accident is fury and injustice, well, boy, is that a great lesson for you, because boy, are you over-attached to material possessions, boy, are you impatient, and boy, are you arrogant. And so there's 3 problems to deal with right away. And life is made up of these delightful experiences, these merciful ones, and these severe ones, and then the experiences on the beam in between them. Now, where you really make your progress is on the beam. That's the truth. Most people would like to think that, well, if you're nice, and if you don't get angry when you get your car accident, that's how you have your spiritual growth. Yes and no. Yes, because those activities, in a sense, on the merciful, your reactions to the merciful things and your reactions to the severe ones, reflect energy back to you. If you do the right thing, if you handle it well and you recognize that, you feel good. You feel like things are going along. You become more confident. You become more willing to trust the world and to trust yourself. And so your development is made easier on the center column. No, in the sense that it's not really that you are improving spiritually because you did a nice thing. It's not that the nice act directly affected you. It is rather that the nice act reoriented you and made you more capable of building your development. So, I'd like to leave you with a little point about all this. And that is that the reason I mentioned the story about the homeless person is because this is very abstract stuff, and it can be real fancy. It can really be interesting, and it's very confusing because there's multiple attributions to every aspect of it. There's 10 different names for each of the Sephiroth. Many of them share the same names, that kind of thing, in certain traditions. But it doesn't mean anything unless you're a human being. And the terrible thing is that you are not a human being because you were born with human genitalia and a human body. Most people who have them are not human. You are a human being if you are kind, merciful, sympathetic, considerate, patient. That is a human being, and you don't meet many of them. And the Sufis used to love to point out that before you could practice a spiritual path, you had to be a human being. And once you became a human being, you didn't want to practice a spiritual path. That was their witty little way of saying that becoming a human being is the spiritual path. But you might all think about that point, that so far as this system helps you to become a real human being, it's effective. Insofar as it distracts you from being a real human being, it is not only ineffective, but positively destructive. And if you apply that particular rule to every activity you have, boy, will you make progress. If it makes you more human, do it. If it takes you away, gives you an excuse for not being human, get it out of your life. It's not going to do much good for you or anybody else. So I'm hoping I'm sending you all out to be human beings, and perhaps I will see you again, perhaps not, but a pleasant life.